Hi, and welcome back to Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. And we are continuing on here in our series here in Romans chapter 11, and we're coming here to a close here. Today we're going to be looking here at verses 25 to 32, so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up. Okay, so we will let Jewett here present the sauce for today. This pericope dealing with the mystery of salvation serves to explain the allusion in 11:23 to 24 about the future engrafting of Israel alongside Gentile converts into the holy olive tree. Although commentaries usually view this section as concentrated on Israel's salvation, the entire world is in fact in view with respect to the power of the gospel to overcome otherwise irresolvable barriers. The pericope contains two major parts: a disclosure of the mystery with scriptural support, 11:25 to 27, and a theological explanation of its significance for salvation history. And that is just really right on the money. And so Jewett here presents us with a good way to approach this. Now maybe all of his comments in this unit may not be the most appropriate, although. Okay, then coming then to our next slide here, we will offer up a translation here for Ugar Thelo Humas Og Na'ain. I do not desire you to be ignorant, brethren, of this mystery, in order that you may not be wise, and will say for par autois in your own estimation, that a parosis, a hardness in part, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles enters in. And in this manner all Israel shall be saved, kathos gegraptai, just as it is written, the deliverer shall come out of Zion, and he shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is the covenant with me, with them, whenever I take away their sins. On the one hand, according to the gospel, they are enemies on your account. But on the other hand, according to election, they are beloved on account of the fathers. For the gifts and calling of God are without regret. For just as you were formerly disobedient to God, but now you were shown mercy in the disobedience of these, in this manner also these were disobedient in your mercy, in order that they also might be shown mercy. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, in order that all might be shown mercy. So this two pantos here mentioned twice. They're equivalent both times. So we'll have something to say here, and basically how to understand this, and that's what we're going to do on our next slide. We'll look at structure. Okay, then coming here, looking at some structure. This is covered under point C here, and it is definitely the conclusion here to all that Paul has stated here in his various dispositios, stemming from 9:6 all the way here to 11:32. And so I've entitled this The Mystery of Israel's Eschatological Salvation,
and the Gentile mission disclosed. And this is definitely conclusionary to all that he has. This is going to come back and reach all the way back, to chapter 9, because it's going to bring up, especially down here in verses 28 to 32, a lot of terminology that Paul had began with in the section, beginning with 9:6 to 29. But anyhow, and this section here from 25 to 32 has two parts, as Jewett mentioned. The first part is Paul's disclosure of Israel's eschatological salvation with scriptural support. And then that's found under point 1 and then point 2 here, Roman numeral. And then looking at the next major section, we have the summary interpretations. And I wanted to put that plural because it's summing up, the immediate context, but also, going back to the beginning. So it's offering, it's layered in how it's summing up the argument. It's going all the way back to the beginning as well. So this is a summary interpretation of the mystery of Israel's judgment, salvation, and the Gentile mission. And here he, I've broken this down into 4 parts here. It begins with Paul's antithetical correlative summary on the one hand and on the other, this men deconstruction. And then on point 2, it goes into a basis clause for this, talking about the irrevocable nature of Israel's divine calling. And then we have a secondary basis statement that further develops the theological nature here of the men de clause found here in 28, and it's a correlative chiasmus summary of both Jews and Gentiles, of their past and present, whether it's obedience or disobedience. And so he presents here the Gentiles and the Jews. And then Paul's final basis statement, his maxim or his proverbial type statement here in 32, and which sums up not only just, 9 to 11, but it also, is in line with the whole statement. Goes back to, that all are guilty, in humanity, and Paul says here that God has imprisoned all to disobedience in order that, and then the purpose of this imprisonment into sin is so that God can freely demonstrate his mercy upon all. And so this is going to be, a very, very key interpretive verse here, how we go about it. And I think Jewett goes, this is where he's going to actually state that this is going to be universal salvation. I think that may be going a little bit too far here, but we will look at that when we get to it. But this is a very important verse, and there is a lot of nuanced interpretation when it comes to this, but we need to look at it seriously. Okay, then coming to examine the text here, we will come to this slide. And we'll notice here that it begins with a gar. So this is basically, it's Paul's basis statement for, of course it's going to sum up the immediate context of basically, 11 following, all the way down to 24. And it brings to a conclusion, all of those Homer arguments that Paul was setting up with that Bildungsmotiv that was building to a crescendo, where it does, it comes to a crescendo here and here, the two main points of the disclosure formula. And so, but it's as he goes on, we can see that this summary point here that Paul is going to develop is going to be very comprehensive to just sum up everything from in chapters 9 to 11. But we begin here, so it begins with gar, and then immediately, Paul goes into this disclosure formula here. I do not desire you to be ignorant, and then he has this vocative here of address adelphoi, brethren, and so he follows this up with, the object of agnaein here is to be ignorant of this mystery. And so this is this is the object here of the complementary infinitive here. It is this mystery, and he has a purpose clause here, a negative purpose clause, in order that you may not be wise in your own estimation, and then it develops here into this haughty clause, which you're either going to take it as epexegetical or appositional. I think epexegetical here would serve would explain it a little better, because it's going to give the explanation of what this mystery is. We have no idea what it is. And so the mystery here comes in it's a bipartite structure here, connected by chi. I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, that, and so he has that there's a partial hardening has happened to Israel. And then there's a temporal clause until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and all Israel shall be saved. And then we have this all important hutos here. In this manner, all Israel shall be saved. And so the hutos here, is a comparative here, taking us back here to, most likely here, to the temporal clause, that there's this partial hardening until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So when these two things happen, when the partial hardness, there's this partial hardness, and this hardness is until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and in this manner, or in this fashion, in this way, all Israel shall be saved. And I think that would be the best way to explain this. And so there's a judicial hardening. There is the salvation of all Israel, and this salvation of all Israel. Pas here has to have a very, very strong force, to it. And remember, if you remember the Old Testament text, like Zechariah 14, that when Christ comes back on the Mount of Olives, at his second coming, and Zechariah presents it as Yahweh, that is Christ. His feet touch down the Mount of Olives. Before that, half the city is captured, taken captive. The women are raped. There's a lot of death, and then those who are left, they escape. Between in the valley that opened up when the Mount of Olives split. And so basically, as Isaiah said, there's only a remnant is going to be saved. There's such a decimation of Israel, but when Yahweh does come back, whoever is left, all Israel at that time will be saved. And I will just take it as all, because now we're talking about we're in the millennium. In the millennial era, and so the Israelites are, by and large, all Israel will be saved. That's how I'm going to interpret this. The fullness of the Gentiles, whatever God's, miracle number is of the Gentiles, when the gospel has gone to the end of the world and everyone's had a chance to respond to God's grace, whether positively or negatively. Then the number would be determined by God, and then that would then bring about the second coming, and I see all Israel being saved, this whole thing taking place, along with the second coming. And then it drops down into this kathos gegreptai, which is going to take us into our next slide. But the mystery here, all that Paul's been referring to, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brethren. And we can see, what is the mystery? Well, Paul, in Ephesians, a little bit later on here, Paul tells us about the mystery. For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ for you Gentiles, if indeed you heard the stewardship of this grace which has been given to me for you, that according to Revelation, the mystery was made known, just as I wrote before in a few, to which you are able, by reading, to know my understanding in the mystery of Christ. I guess we'll just say to different generations, it was not made known to the sons of men, as it is now revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit, for the Gentiles to be fellow heirs, fellow members of the body, fellow partakers of the promise of Christ Jesus through the gospel, which I became a minister according to the grace which was of God given to me, according to the inner working of his power. And so, hopefully I read all that right. It's pretty small writing, but I'm pretty sure I got it all. And so this mystery is basically that God is creating, one new man in Christ, and that the Jews and the Gentiles all partake of salvation, and that is and that's basically this has been Paul's theme in this letter, that the righteousness of God is being revealed from heaven, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, and the righteousness of God is the demonstration of Christ dying for us, and that is the gospel, the good news that his sacrifice provided righteousness for all who believe, and so whether Jew or Gentile, and so that is the mystery, but the mystery here is talking more about the eschatological nature of Israel's salvation, because that's been the point, since chapter 9, is that, well, gosh, if about the golden chain, that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Well, if that's true, how did Israel get separated from the love of Christ? And then Paul is talking. He's taken all of this to say that a partial hardening has occurred to Israel until. And so that is then the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. That would then, you need to look back to Luke 21, and that the city of Jerusalem is trampled underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And that these statements I would take would be similar. And when you look at the book of Revelation, it's the title deed to the earth is when Christ returns, in the cloud on the horse with the holy angels and the saints from heaven, and he, kills the Antichrist. Well, that's the end of the Gentiles. The end of the Gentiles has come to an end, and Jerusalem's no longer trodden underfoot. Well, because Christ just, stepped on the Mount of Olives, split it in half, and killed, at the Battle of Armageddon, all of the warring armies of the Gentiles who were trying to conquer Christ at his second coming. And so this verse, verse here 25 is fairly complicated. We have this, negative purpose clause in order that you may not be wise in your own estimation. So that the Gentiles would, not think highly of themselves beyond, above the Jews here who are about to be saved, and for them to have a humble attitude in fear, knowing that, hey, well, they were cut off because of unbelief, and surely the same thing can happen to us. And that's why, salvation is absolutely 100% conditional. It's conditional upon your continued, belief and confession in Christ, and persevering here, obviously, to the end. And this is what Paul's stating here in this chapter. Just look at Israel's. They were partially hardened because of their sin. So these are very important verses, and to be able then to kind of put this all together, you just have to have a broader biblical understanding of New Testament eschatological issues, and I'm sure other people may differ from me, but this is my reading of the New Testament, and how I would correlate this salvation of all Israel. Well, it's when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. When's that? Well, it's when the times of the Gentiles have come to an end, and we know that just look at Matthew 24, look at Luke 21, Mark 13. It's all pretty well spelled out there in all of the discourse, in whatever variety you want to look at in the synoptics. And then you just correlate that to, the book of Revelation, and voila. Okay, so we'll look here at some statements here that Dr. Jewett made here concerning the word mysterion. It was widely used in Greco-Roman religion, particularly in the mystery religions, and was equally popular in apocalyptic Judaism and various branches of early Christianity. Common features of these traditions of the mysterion include the premise of limited access to divine knowledge, of course, the demand to refrain from revealing content to the uninitiated. The role of prophetic or visionary characters in gaining access to such knowledge. We saw that in when Paul talked about that it was revealed to the holy apostles and prophets. And the crucial role of angelic mediation and visionary journeys to otherwise inaccessible realms of divine knowledge. A fundamental disparity between insiders to whom the mysteries were revealed and the outsiders, whose access is barred, is evident in widespread literary references and also in the etymology of musterion, derived from muain, to close, probably referring to the maintenance of closed lips about secrets. In literature close to the New Testament, there are frequent demands to avoid disclosure to outsiders. For example, the community document from Qumran here from Cave 1:4-6 demands concealment concerning the truth of the mysteries of knowledge. And Ezra is told that you alone were worthy to learn of the secret of the Most High. Therefore write all these things that you have seen in a book, and put it in a hidden place, and you shall teach them to the wise among your people, whose hearts you know are able to comprehend and keep these secrets. In the light of these rhetorical observations, what Paul discloses here is authoritative, new doctrine, an oracle whose authority derives from God. And so Paul did say that, these mysteries were, not disclosed to ages past, but were made known now to God's holy apostles and New Testament prophets. And that is definitely how you ought to understand that in the book of Ephesians. This mystery was made known, and that's basically the inclusion of the Gentiles in salvation with Israel. But Paul's mainly, the part of the mystery that he's looking at is, what's really happening with Israel, and how does Israel relate with the church? And so that was all, that was what Paul was working through there in chapters 9 to 11 here in Romans. And the apex, the absolute climax, is that we know from the Old Testament text that there's a glorious future for Israel. And it by and large, it would coincide with the second coming, of Christ, where the kingdom is fully come. And now when you look back at all the parables of the kingdom of Christ, you can then see the eschatological nature that it happens at, Christ comes to establish the kingdom at the second coming for a millennia, 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth. And that is definitely how I follow the New Testament, and this Paul's fully revealing the mysterion of how all Israel becomes saved. Okay, then coming here then to our next slide, we'll pick this up. We're looking here at verses 26 and 27. But we got to remember that this stems out of here. Paul's second, excuse me, his compound sentence, his second sentence here, and all Israel in this manner, all Israel shall be saved. Kathos, okay, just kathos gegraptai, just as it is written. So then this is the citation formula, introductory citation formula, which opens up then into a midrashic complex, which is a midrashic complex is basically a combination of two or more verses that has been reworked in as if it was one. And so it's the combination of one or more scriptures into one. And so stemming from Isaiah 59 here, and then coming down here, Isaiah, chapter 27, Paul then, explains that how all Israel is saved. It's through the deliverer, who has to be Christ. And it says, and just as it is written, the deliverer shall come out of Zion. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is the covenant from me with them whenever I take away their sin. And so this is Paul's midrashic complex, and so this deliverer who comes out of Zion. Now we know the text says it says for on account on account of Zion he comes, but this one here says from Zion, and I don't really I don't know if we take this talking about the heavenly Zion. I don't think that Paul's really gone there here in the book of Romans. So to try to take Hebrews 12 into here, I don't I don't know if that I don't think that's legitimate. But we do know that Christ comes to comes for Jerusalem and for Zion. So he's going to go there, and then after he goes there, then he's going to deliver, he's going to come out of the city to deliver, the rest of his people. So it's legitimate then to look at the, just the progression of the whole scene of Christ coming from heaven to Jerusalem, and then from, because remember, he's not coming back to Hollywood. He's coming back to Jerusalem, where where there's the Antichrist army is trying to defeat all his people and him, and he slays them by the breath of his mouth, and he comes on the horse, and he's the deliverer, okay, and this is when he turns away the ungodliness from Jacob. And then, again, this is a compound statement here of this, just as it is written. And then he combines here Isaiah 27, this is the covenant from me with them, and then we have, this temporal clause, whenever, I take away their sin. And so basically the context here, even from the book of Isaiah, the whole thing is about judicial hardening of Israel. I mean, his whole calling. Just go back to Isaiah chapter 6, and this and even the whole chapter of 59 explains the sin of Israel. So this was very important that Paul's looking here at, well, how does Israel get saved? Well, there has to be a deliverer who would be Christ. And the covenant that God is going to make with Israel at this time is that he's going to remove the sin of Israel. Now, these are the people, these Israelites here, folks, they're not on a horse. These are the Israelites that, ran between the mountains. These are the Israelites that live in the millennium as mere humans. Remember, those who were truly saved, the elect of Israel, according to, as we saw in verses 1 to, 10 of chapter 11, those elect of Israel that were truly born again and accepted Christ, they have a glorified body. They now have a glorified body at the resurrection. But these Jews that he's talking about here are these that the Jews that lived, through the Great Tribulation, and they just now recognize Christ as, their Messiah. They just came to the realization, that, wow, we blew it, and that's why Revelation starts off with, he comes in the clouds of heaven, and they'll look upon them whom they pierced. So that's the theme. That's another midrashic complex, Revelation chapter 1, and that would explain this here too. This whole thing here. That's my understanding in of how to understand Paul's mystery and these scriptures, and I'm sticking with it. All right, then moving right along here, coming here then to verses 28 and 29 here, and looking here at our structure, we're coming here to summary interpretations of the mystery of Israel's judgment, salvation, and the Gentile mission. And that's going to sum up everything that's going to be spoken here in this last paragraph in 28 to 32. Now, our focus here is, first of all, is Paul's antithetical correlative summary of Israel's present mystery and the Gentile mission. So the emphasis here is on present, because we just came off of the Paul's future statement that when the times of the Gentiles, when the full number of the Gentiles comes in, then all Israel will be saved. And so now he, without a some type of word like un here that could be put in, therefore, to lead us to a summary. Paul doesn't have that for the sake of his parallelistic and antithetical type language that he wants to use here. But it's still functioning as a summary point, all of 28 to 32. And so we have here, Paul makes these two observations with a basis clause. So 28 and 29 are a package deal, and they need to be kept together here. And so one is, you're looking here at this predicate nominative here. On the one hand, they are enemies according to the gospel on account of you. And on the other hand, they are beloved according to election on account of the fathers. So I would take both of these uses of dia here as causal in my interpretation, and then we the verb here has to be supplied. It's just the use of ellipsis here, and they're both constructed as predicate nominatives here, and they're antithetically brought into comparison here through the use of mendeh. Okay, these correlative particles that would either separate ideas, and definitely here they're separating ideas antithetically. So in the present time now, to come back from this future prophecy, he's coming now back to, okay, well, let's come back to where we're at. Well, on the one hand, the Jews, they're enemies according to the gospel on account of you. And on the other hand, they are beloved according to election on account of the Father. So this is why, according to election here, so this is why, when we look at chapters 9 to 11, it's looking at, Israel as, as being elected to be the bearers of Yahweh's, covenant, and they were elected to, to be the bearers of God's covenant, with the world. If you go back to chapter 9, it says, talking about the gifts and calling, that, they have, sonship, they have glory, they have the covenants, the giving of the law, worship, and the promises, as well as the gift of the Messiah that is given to the world. So these are, so Israel is beloved. So God's never going to, totally reject his people and cast them out. he's keeping them alive for this future generation, and some of them are able to come to the gospel and believe in the present time, but the unbelieving Jews are viewed as our enemies on the basis of the gospel, and they're just set in opposition, and they're hardened in their sin, and they're not looking for the righteousness that Christ provided. They're looking, to provide their own righteousness, and that's not sufficient. But this election language here, they are beloved, according to election. Well, that all speaks back to chapter 9, how God chose the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then from Jacob, it stops there, because all of Jacob's then, lineage then becomes the Israelite nation, and they are chosen by God to be the bearers of God's covenant in the world at the time, and until right now, there is no without Israel, there's no church. So if Israel ceased to exist, there would be no church. I mean, the church is remember, we're grafted into the rich root of the olive. And then the basis clause here is the basis basically functioning here to explain, but they are beloved according to election on account of the fathers. For the gifts and calling of God are without regret. And so we have here another statement here that looks back, the gifts and calling. Remember, the calling places, this language goes straight back to chapter 9, and so does election. So all of this goes back to verses 12 and 13 of chapter 9. And so that's why, when we come here to chapters 9 to 11, it's best to view the corporate idea of Israel here as being the bearers of, they're chosen, and that's what Paul's talking about in all of chapter 9. Paul was weeping and wanting to, exchange his soul for theirs. Well, he's talking about the unbelieving Israelites, right? To whom were given the adoption and glory and the covenants and the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. Okay, back in 9:4, and so in this whole section of 28 to 32, all the language that Paul's used from chapter 9 forward is being recycled here. And that's very important to see here. But the gifts and the calling of God, well, the calling, goes with the election, okay, and the gifting, the enhancements they all go together. You don't get one without the other. And so they were given without regret, and the offer is there, and all they have to do is, if they repent, then the veil's taken away, and they can believe and become regrafted into their own olive tree. Okay, and then some of these words here of Wagner concerning this verse are very important. Paul highlights God's continuing commitment to Israel by loading Romans 11:28 to 29 with the terminology of election with respect to election, kata tain ek lagein, picks up Paul's earlier discussion of the present remnant according to God's gracious election, lema kat eklagein caritas in 11:5, and he eklage in 11:7, and extends the referent of eklage, the election, beyond the remnant to embrace all Israel. The affirmation that the people of Israel, Jacob, in the quotation from Isaiah in verse 26, are beloved by God, adelphoi, echoes the declaration of God cited by Paul in Romans 9:13. Jacob I have loved. In the language of gifts, charismata, and calling, klesis, 11:29, further recalls the conclusion Paul draws from Malachi's oracle, Romans 9:11-12, that the election of Israel is due not to works, but to God's purpose in accordance with his choice. A purpose which issues in God's gracious calling of people to salvation, ek to kaluntas. Moreover, the phrase "on account of the fathers" evokes the narrative of God's election of the patriarchs, recounted briefly by Paul in Romans 9:6-13. Seen in light of Romans 11:26-28, this earlier passage takes on new significance. Whatever Paul's caveat, "not all from Israel or Israel," means, it is clear by this point in Paul's argument that Israel encompasses a number far greater than those Jews who have presently embraced the gospel. Even the rest who have temporarily been rendered insensible remain beloved on account of God's gracious election of their ancestors. And Wagner's just a very excellent and well-balanced commentator. And if you haven't seen his works, go ahead and look up this great author. Okay, then moving right along here, now we come to Paul's second basis statement. So we have gar here used right away. So we had the first gar in the previous verse, v29, and then these are all just going to be stacked up. This one here comes in right here at verse 30, and then it's going to end with Paul's third one in verse 32. So Paul's just going gar, and he's just making basis summary statements as he's moving along here. And so we have a correlative chiasmus summary of both Jews and Gentiles. And it starts off, "For just as you," and then it's going to be in the same manner also these. So this is going to be the correlative statements. So it begins here, "For just as you were formerly disobedient to God, but now you were shown mercy in the disobedient, or by the disobedience of these. And these, in the same manner, also were disobedient now in or by by your mercy," right? And then a purpose clause, "in order that they may also be shown mercy," and noon here may or may not be here as a temporal clause. But anyhow, so Paul's making these, verse 28, it was very tightly constructed, of this compound sentence that he had, on the one hand, they are enemies on your account because, according to the gospel, and on the other hand, they are beloved on account of the fathers according to election. So that was a very tightly, antithetically correlated sentence, and then Paul is still moving on in the same way, but he's using chiasmus here as a way in which to correlate the thoughts, these bifurcated thoughts, in that, the Gentiles, so we're talking about the Gentiles' past and present situation, and then the Jews' present and future situation. So he's Paul's continuing looking at the inclusion of the Gentiles, and at the same time, the focus has always here been on Israel, and so these two groups are in Paul's mind all the way through here, through this section, and the purpose is in order that they may also be shown mercy. So he's building this up so that everybody is shown mercy, and that's exactly where this thing's coming to in his his last statement here in verse 32, and this is very, very beautifully written, and we'll see some good remarks here from Douglas Moo. Okay, but before we see and look at Douglas Moo here, we first got to take up verse 32. And so we have here Paul's final basis statement. So this is his third, use of gar here, and it comes in the form of a maxim of God's divine purposes for humanity's salvation. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience in order that he might show mercy to all. So obviously he's talking here about Israel and the Gentiles, and just as everyone has been shut up in, God shut up all in disobedience, okay, and that means everybody, nobody's being excluded from this. This goes back. Paul's not only just summing up chapters 9 to 11, he's summing up everything from chapter 1:18 following, okay, all the way to here. Because when we come to chapter 12, now Paul is giving, he's addressing the Roman congregation personally. So, this has been Paul's defense of his own gospel. So this, verse 32 is not only just summing up 9 to 11, it's summing up the whole book so far. And this is a summary statement. God has shut up all in disobedience, or he has imprisoned all. And then the purpose for that is in that he may show mercy to all. And so all here is the same as all down here. Now, we're not looking at this verse to go with universalism. That's obviously not Paul's. You're going to have some authors like Jewett. He's going to just, follow this hook, line, and sinker with Dodd. C.H. Dodd, and other typically, liberal scholars are going to look at this as some universalistic statement that Paul makes. I just don't. We just can't read it that way. Any person here cannot do that. It's just sometimes it's a loose use of all. But you could say that God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. He sends the sun on the just and the unjust. God, there's no person alive that God hasn't demonstrated his own mercy upon. Okay, it's just whether or not we as people respond to that demonstration of God's mercy, where we then take possession of it in a salvific sense. But God demonstrates his mercy to everybody, and there's nobody that has ever lived that can tell God, well, you never showed mercy to me. I don't really think that's ever going to be an option for anybody at the Last Judgment. And there's some different ways here that people are looking to interpret this verse, and I would like to show some presentations of some very good exegetes that I'm not going to take issue with. I would share their understanding here in this verse. Okay, then coming here to Douglas Moo, interpretations of the verse go astray when it's wrenched from its context. One glaring and serious example of such a misinterpretation is the view that Paul is here teaching a salvific universalism, as God has confined every single person in sin, so he will have mercy, save every single person. I understand that's the way that it can definitely be understood. I would tend to water down here the mercy part. The mercy part that God is going to then demonstrate and give to all can eventuate in salvation if people take it that far. But I would just say that according to Matthew, that God sends the rain and the sun upon the just and the unjust. God, and Acts makes a similar statement that he provides seasons of food and clothing for all. And so this would come along with the same way here, but to think of strictly that demonstrating mercy has to mean salvation. I understand the tension here, and I understand what Douglas Moo's saying. I don't want to necessarily disagree with him here. He's well within the pale of a lot of interpreters, and so I don't want to say I'm disagreeing, generally with his statement here. But such a conclusion is obviously contradictory to Paul's teaching elsewhere. Amen. And so he's not going to then look at this as a universalistic teaching of salvation here, and he's just going to state here, that being the case, all might refer to the unbelieving Jews about whom Paul has been speaking in verse 31, but we can hardly eliminate from Paul's reference the Gentiles in the Church of Rome, whom Paul has been addressing throughout this section. Considering the corporate perspective that is basic to chapter 11, then it seems best to think that all refers all the groups about which Paul has been speaking. For example, Jews and Gentiles. Paul is not saying that all humans will be saved. Rather, he's saying that God has imprisoned in disobedience first Gentiles and now Jews, so that he may bestow mercy on each of these groups of humanity. How many from each of these groups will ultimately be saved, Paul does not say, and that's acceptable, and we're all going to we're going to be in agreement here with Mill. Okay, then coming along here with Schreiner, some scholars conclude that either universalism is taught here, or it cannot be ruled out, since the text says that God shut up all Pontos to disobedience in order to extend his mercy upon Pontos. They argue that Pontos must have the same denotation in both parts of the verse, and thus all people without exception are included. Such an interpretation does not abide by the contextual limits of the Pauline discussion, for the previous verses clarify that the second Pontos refers to Jews and Gentiles as groups. The purpose is not to teach that all people without exception are recipients of God's mercy. This is where I probably would disagree. God demonstrates mercy to all, but not all are going to accept that mercy in a salvific manner. That's how I would come down on this. Maybe a little bit more nuanced than what Schreiner wants to go. But that all people without distinction, Jews and Gentiles, are the beneficiaries of his saving grace. And we definitely would agree with that. So Schreiner, you did a good job. And I thought some of the thoughts here of Sandy and Headlam were very apropos for this particular verse. St. Paul now generalizes from these instances the character of God's plan and concludes his argument with a maxim which solves the riddle of divine action. There is a divine purpose in the sin of mankind described in chapters 118 to 320. There is a divine purpose in the faithlessness of the Jews. The object of both alike is to give an occasion for the exhibition of divine mercy. If God has shut men up in sin, it is only that he may have an opportunity of showing his compassion. So in Galatians 3:22, the Scripture has imprisoned all under sin in order that the promise of faith of Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. The result of sin is represented as being to give the occasion for the fulfillment of the promise and the mission of the Messiah. All God's dealing with the race are in accordance with his final purpose. However harsh they may seem, when we contemplate the final end, we can only burst forth into thankfulness to God. And so he's basically reading this vis-a-vis Galatians 3:20, which I would definitely, that's just how you gotta come out on this, is that God is demonstrating his mercy, and whether it becomes a salvific event or not is up to the individual. Okay, but God is definitely demonstrating his mercy upon all. So I think that's, I guess I would have a nuanced interpretation of how he's speaking about God demonstrating his mercy upon all. And I think that my interpretation, pans out, especially when you view it vis-a-vis Galatians or through Matthew. Okay, this has been another session of Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This has been a joy here for me to endeavor in this pursuit here in Romans 9-11. It's a very, very important portion of Scripture, and it is very important for pastors and theologians to give their understanding, their present understanding of what these verses mean, and hopefully this series here has blessed you, and we will continue on next time.